Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here. I feel like this has been a long time coming since I'm a fan of the TCD community, but it's been a difficult journey for me in this PhD, but we don't need to get into that right now. But I actually am going to talk about my experience applying food sovereignty in the field. And this was supposed to be my PhD research. So I conducted this field work 2 years ago. Is the sound a problem right now? No?
Okay.
Somebody is playing over here. Okay. So, yeah, I collected this exploratory data like two years ago, and I honestly had put this aside for 2 years because when I came back, I ended up having changes in my committee, which led to changes in my research site. So I didn't even really know when I was going to get back to this. So this TCD talk was a great opportunity to kind of reflect on what happened in the field and how I'm kind of reinterpreting some of these findings. So, for me, it would be great to get any feedback from, people on where they see me in this process of reinterpreting the findings and maybe possible like ways forward, if there's anything to salvage here. But a little overview of what we'll be talking about. I want to start with the motivation, what motivated me to do this project and ask these questions, and how I am defining the problem statement. So I'll talk about food sovereignty and the Amazon and the global food system, which makes the question of food sovereignty more relevant, and how this is expressed with smallholders adopting cattle and specializing in cattle. And then a gap in the literature that I interpret as a gap in the literature that helped me form the questions. And then I'll get into the research objectives, how I selected my site, and the methods I used in my fieldwork, which basically is me talking about what my fieldwork was. And then I'll get into some of the big challenges I had in the field applying this concept of food sovereignty. And right now, with this presentation, I've kind of had a chance to reinterpret those findings, like look at that again. So that's how I want to conclude with kind of how I'm rethinking what happened in the field. So let's start with talking about food sovereignty. It's a broad-based peasant movement that stands against the global food system. So it explicitly calls for the rights of farmers, communities, and countries to define their own food policies and not be dependent on, the rules set by transnational corporations. So food sovereignty goes a step beyond food security because it's not only concerned with people having access to nutritious food at all times, but it also questions or believes that people should also choose where their food is coming from. And by adding that, challenge, it makes it where now we can ask questions about the production system, where the food security doesn't really challenge food production systems. So food sovereignty kind of adds that dimension to it. And by shifting farmers away from serving the needs of global trading systems, the food sovereignty movement focuses on local needs and local food markets, thus freeing small-scale producers in developing countries from the unfair and unbalanced trade rules that are upheld by the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. So there really is a big focus on promoting a local economy and doing that with locally sourced products and focusing on small-scale agriculture and adopting agroecological methods. That kind of is all like the package of food sovereignty. So the idea is that by encouraging self-reliance, wide-scale implementation of food sovereignty would insulate both farmers and consumers from the price volatility on world markets that result from financial speculation. So again, the focus is on strengthening local economies so that small farmers are not so vulnerable to the changes in the global food system, which we can see with the food crisis that happened in 2008, and just these repeated, actually even in the pandemic, we can see problems with relying on a very concentrated world food system. So that's kind of my driving, this isn't really a theoretical framework, but it's, my driving motivation, kind of like the scholarship that I want to contribute to. So the way I am problematizing this, the reason why there's issues of food sovereignty in this region in the Amazon. So my problem statement is that given the Amazon's increasing role as a global food supplier of beef, there's becoming a lot of opportunities for smallholders to specialize in cattle and abandon traditional agricultural systems. So this, raises food sovereignty questions because it weakens the local food economy by diverting local suppliers, right, to the global market, and it diminishes, the opportunities, variety, and availability of local foods. So that's why these two things are connected, as this region becomes more well-established in the meat chain, the global meat chain. So there's definitely been a lot of studies looking into this transition, and this transition isn't exclusive to south of Pará. It's happening all over the Amazon, as the cattle industry is one of the main threats to the forest. So there's a lot of studies that have looked into why farmers choose to transition to cattle, right? What's the decision-making process? And it's pretty straightforward, and pretty consistent throughout the literature. I mean, cattle do provide a lot of benefits over crops when you consider the challenges that and the labor intensivity of agriculture. So cattle are mobile, they're multifunctional, so they provide a lot of byproducts, not just calves and dairy.
Oh, it's like someone's pet. Yeah.
I've been there.
Okay, sorry. And cattle's not as labor intensive, that's why it's definitely very attractive when there's such a shortage of labor. And again, focusing in the south of Pará, it's a very well established market. I think in the next slide, do I talk about the, no, I don't. But this region has become kind of like an agro-industrial hub for meat because there's a lot of modern meat packing facilities in this region. So there's really a direct connection, smallholders can have a direct connection to the global market. But this connection is tied to the larger ranchers in the region. So because it's such a well-established market, there's really not any problem with selling cattle. And the middlemen, sorry, I put middle there, but it's middlemen are the main buyers, so these that are kind of working for the larger ranchers, they can come directly to the property and buy cattle. But a huge reason also for this transition to cattle is that there's credit incentives. It's a lot easier to get loans for cattle than anything else. And with that comes all the tech support, which is lacking with crops. Another reason for the south of Pará in particular is that since it is a region dominated by the cattle industry, it's mostly pasture at this point. So when settlers receive land or buy land, they're receiving it already as pasture, and a lot of the times don't have the investment necessary to prepare that soil for agriculture. Another reason that is difficult for adopting crops is there's so many accidental fires. I've actually met a few cases of settlers that had decided to adopt permanent agriculture. So they had an agroforestry system starting, and because of an accidental fire, everything got wiped out, and they didn't have the money to reinvest in that again. So it was just a complete loss. So that's also something that people are scared of in investing because of these things that happen. So since there's a lot of studies, looking at this transition, I've found what I interpret as a gap in the literature is that the way these studies analyze the socio-economic dynamics and livelihood strategies of smallholders, right? But these studies are always framed in relation to the peasants' environmental impact, or how their livelihood strategies promote the best balance between conservation and production. And that most of the time leaves questions about their food security and food sovereignty unexplored. So I thought this could give a different dynamic and understanding to livelihoods by focusing on food security and food sovereignty. And even within the food sovereignty literature, there's actually a lot of limitations too, because it's still very much at a conceptual level. There's not a lot of studies that try to empirically analyze food sovereignty. So there's not many studies that operationalize and measure it. So I also saw this as an opportunity to, try to contribute to that literature. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is when I reached my research objective. So I was interested in conducting a food system analysis to identify the possibility for localizing the food system and explore local alternatives to the cattle economy. So at this point, I was in an exploratory phase, and I thought that doing a food system analysis would help reveal some of the maybe holes or deficiencies in the food system that could, illuminate a specific research question. But for my exploratory phase, I was asking, to what extent do smallholders in an MST-formed agrarian settlement participate in their local food system? So it's very important that I clarify what is an MST formed agrarian reform settlement. So MST, which is the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Terra, or the Rural Landless Movement, is one of the actually the largest peasant movement in Latin America, and definitely in the history of Brazil, one of the most organized movements. And their fight is for radical agrarian reform. So their mission is to mobilize rural workers. But from my experience, actually, a lot of them were just urban dwellers. I mean, they just kind of go to the cities and recruit people that are interested in having access to land. And their main strategy is to occupy private lands that are not fulfilling a social function. Now, this is something that's protected under the Brazilian Constitution, and it causes a lot of contention because how to define social function here, can go both ways. But ultimately, they fight for the redistribution of land and try to fight the large landholding concentrations in Brazil. Brazil has a huge problem of land inequality. And in doing this, they promote agroecology and food sovereignty. So they're one of the main voices for food sovereignty in Brazil. So it makes a lot of sense for me to pick, if I want to talk about food sovereignty, to pick a site where the MST was involved in. Now, for this region in particular, the way that MST promotes agroecology and food sovereignty is through the support of dairy production. So, of course, they realize the importance of the cattle industry in the region. So they see dairy as a sustainable option to focusing only on meat. So these are some pictures from the settlement that I finally decided on, because at first I wasn't actually sure about just doing one settlement, but it became clear that each settlement, it is its own universe. So having a more in-depth understanding of one settlement, the history, I thought would be more helpful. And this is a very special settlement for a lot of reasons. I have next slide explains the significance of this settlement, 26 de Março. It was the first property to be expropriated from the most powerful oligarchy in the region, the Mutran family. I didn't really get into this, but another important factor about the south of Pará is just that it's notorious for its very violent land conflict history. So this, of course, has fueled a lot of the tension between the landless and the farmers in this region. So the fact that this settlement, they were able to take it from one of the most powerful families in the region was, a huge victory. And another point is that the property was expropriated on the grounds of human rights violations and environmental crimes, making it the first property in Brazil to be expropriated for these reasons. And some other reasons that make this, a good settlement to study is that it's got a lot of benefits going for it, like geographically even, because it's close to the city. So this would facilitate the settlers having access to markets. It's very close to the highway. It's not isolated at all. And it is also a site of an agricultural school, a technical school, so a university. And it's also, there's a public school in it also, which actually the picture previously, this is the campus, the school campus. And another interesting thing about the settlement is that it is the only settlement in the region with the raio de sol design. So this is how the settlement looks like. So each little strip is somebody's property, is how they divided the farm. So that whole thing used to be just one landholding, right? And with the MST process, they divided into 206 families. So these are the different properties that, and the idea with this design is that it would keep people from isolating, which is something that happens when people get land. They usually become more individualized, and all that kind of social structure that was strong and present during the occupation phase, kind of is lost. So part of this reason for designing it this way was to keep that from happening. So I went to the field in 2018, basically spent spring there from January to April. And during that time, I conducted 25 interviews. Now, these were not systematic because I was, just really connecting with a lot of people in different branches, and sectors too, like private and public sector. Well, actually, I take that back. I did not really contact anyone in the private sector, but I had representation from, government representatives. I talked to a lot of university professors to talk about my research ideas. I talked to some NGOs that are active in the region, and of course the social movement leaders. Now, let me just see my next slide really quick. Okay. So for most of my field work, I focus on applying the food system approach, and by first identifying and then connecting with different stakeholders involved in circulating food in Marabá, in the city. And that's why I started with the public sector, to understand how the local government is involved in food distribution. So I began by contacting the Department of Social Assistance, which they're supposed to be in charge for the food security policies that have been established at the national level. And before I actually got to Marabá, I did go to Brasilia, the capital, almost exclusively to get contacts in the state of Pará, because prior to going to the field, of course I researched all the Brazilian websites, and none of them were active. There was all broken links everywhere and out of date information. So I had to go to Brasilia to talk to a general coordinator in the Ministry of Social Development, which is the ministry that oversees the food security and food sovereignty policies in Brazil, just so that I can have contact and understand who's in charge in Pará. And so in Pará, I also went at the state level so that they could tell me who was in charge in Marabá and in other cities. So finally, when I did get to Marabá, which was the Department of Social Assistance, to find out how they were implementing, food security policies, basically, she told me that they were supposed to form a committee, but they just, there were many attempts to try to organize people to do this, but with no success. And to add on top of that, she said there was no even prospect of these conversations continuing. So there really wasn't a lot of interest at the municipal level in talking about food security. So that kind of like hit a little bit of a wall there in terms of understanding the policy dynamic of food security in Brazil. But I also, visited the Department of Health, Department of Education, and all these public institutions play a role in the distribution of food. So the Department of Education was probably the most significant one in terms of connecting with family agriculture, because of the law that requires that 30% of the school meals are sourced from local farmers. And I actually got to attend one of the bidding sessions of where they were selecting the family farmers to provide the food. And for the whole, municipality, there were only 5 cooperatives. So ideally, you need to come as a cooperative. So even though they told me that individuals can come and bid for, providing their produce, it's really cooperatives that, seem to get it. And I thought it was interesting that even the cooperatives, not all of them were from Marabá. There were actually a cooperative from another city. So when I was talking to a different NGO about this, they did mention like some of the limitations of this policy of, sourcing food for the school meals, because there's loopholes in there that make it where family agriculture isn't really being privileged, because we have these co-ops that are not necessarily family agriculture in these bidding sessions, and they usually can offer the lowest price, so they end up winning. But I also visited the Department of Agriculture to understand their role in supporting smallholder, family agriculture in the region. And the majority of their activities were providing free seedlings, mechanization, and technical assistance, but they were extremely understaffed and underfunded, with only 5 technicians for the entire municipality, and with a budget of 9 million. Just so you can have a comparison, the municipality next door, which actually was a lot more active in terms of creating a food security committee, and in just the topic of food sovereignty in general, their budget, so the city is Paraupebas, their budget was of 60 million. So it was a crazy difference. But the thing about Paraupebas is that the Vale, the huge mining corporation in Brazil, is present there. So they have a role in a lot of these public entities. So, yeah, I found that Marabá, even though being right next to Paraubebas was very disadvantaged when it came to having funding for supporting family agriculture. So after I kind of collected this information about how the public sector is involved in the food system, I applied a community food assessment, which was a questionnaire that I applied to only 10 households, but in the Assentamento 26 de Março. And this household interview I was really focused on consumption and production. You know, this is kind of where I was saying earlier that I found like the gap in literature, because these questions, you know, were about food preparation, food preferences, you know, food access, like where do they get their food? Do they buy it? Do they exchange it? The seasonality of their food, food source, food waste. You know, as somebody that has studied a lot of family agriculture in the Amazon, these questions about consumption, you know, I never see them. So this was, you know, something I was interested in. And of course, I also asked about production. So what is produced, how much, you know, their production systems, their decision-making process on what to produce, you know, all these production-related questions. And of course, the idea here, if in an ideal world, you know, food sovereignty, these would be related, and a lot of their consumption would be coming from their own production, or if not their own, you know, very nearby from the local market. But I had quite a few challenges in the field that came from many directions, not only challenges of doing just work in Brazil, you know, that I'm going to mention soon, like the policy challenges, but also the way I was framing my research, I think was very problematic. So some of the policy challenges, since Marabá never formed the Food Policy Committee, they couldn't benefit from the food security funding. So my initial idea of understanding food sovereignty from a policy level, you know, was done at that moment. And even by analyzing the school lunch program, which is one of the most successful cases of how policy supports a family agriculture, 26 de Março never formed a cooperative, so they never sold to school lunches. So that policy idea was out of the question too. And at a state level, when I was in Belém talking to them about how they're implementing, you know, these food security policies, I was just hearing a lot of like, it's still very new, you know, we haven't really done much, like we're going to meet next month to talk about it. It was just, there hadn't been a lot of development. So I think Pará is just kind of behind in adopting these food security policies. And I also had challenges with food system analysis. So once I did the community food assessment, which was kind of part one for me, because I was looking at consumption and production, like looking at the household level, my idea was to have a larger food system analysis, right? Because that goes beyond just what people are consuming. Of course, it goes into the distribution, processing, and packaging of food. But I definitely underestimated how difficult it would be to access that kind of data, since it's, you know, private data from these supermarket chains. And since a lot of people were buying their food from supermarkets, you know, almost all of it, I would need to take that next step. And there were, you know, logistical challenges in that. And since this was more of an exploratory field work, I really relied on the process of analyzing the food system to reveal my research questions, instead of coming to the field with a very operationalized concept of food sovereignty and how I wanted to measure it. You know, so that was really a big limitation for me. So given these challenges, I made a video and showing my fieldwork experience and what I ended up with. So let me share that with you guys. This is really embarrassing, by the way. Not a good video, but what the hell. Okay. If it hadn't been for my field experience, I probably would not have been able to identify the issues in my original proposal and probably would still be lost trying to make food sovereignty work. I spent most of my field work trying to understand how smallholders control their local food system. One of my objectives was to map the food system in order to identify opportunities to improve the local economy. Since this is a region dominated by industrial agriculture, I wanted to design a project that could help bring food sovereignty to the area. This strategy turned out to be a mistake. I didn't have any data to collect, so my research didn't develop. I realized that what I was doing was actually playing the role of an NGO and no longer of a researcher. I prematurely chose food sovereignty as the solution to the cattle problem without allowing this process to flow organically from the research. After speaking with my advisor, we were able to come up with a new research project based on my observations and field experience. So for my reefer project, I came up with a very unlikely result, a new project. My focus now is understanding why land reform settlements dissipate once they are formed. The landless movement defends rural workers' constitutional right to land that does not serve a social function. Their main role is to organize occupations on large land properties that, if successful, are disappropriated and distributed to the people that endured the years of occupation. During the occupation, people live in precarious living conditions, but social cohesion is very strong. However, once the settlement is formed, families tend to become autonomous, and all of the organizational structure that was built throughout the years of occupation disintegrates. The transition from occupation to settlement is a critical phase that reorganizes not only the geographical space, but also the social relationships. Understanding the factors that lead to the weakening of their internal organization is now my main focus, as I believe it is a key barrier to an agroecological transition. Okay. Very embarrassing, guys. I'm really sorry. So this is what field work felt like for me, but probably not really fit there. Oh my God, I'm really sorry. DB, no. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. My initial approach of relying on food system analysis was problematic because I never really truly had a research question, because I was hoping it would come from the food system analysis. And I was overly concerned with creating a project that would directly benefit the people in the community that I was working with. This was always a concern of mine. So I thought that it would be beneficial to the community for me to do a food system analysis. Of course, I talked to them about it and they seemed interested in it. But you know, after going through this process, I see that it really was more of like my idea and me trying to like impose an ideal and really a solution to a problem that I was problematizing, you know? So it felt that helping them transition into a more local system was not viable because there was no institutional framework to support them. So I really became disillusioned with food sovereignty in that sense, because what was I helping these people towards? You know, I mean, there was no local food system for them to be a part of anyway. Like they would have to create that on their own. And understanding the challenges that people had in even doing the little agriculture that they did, it seemed just very disconnected from of me, you know, to try to bring that idea. You know, even though I was coming from a place of, you know, this is an MST settlement, and MST, you know, promotes these ideas. In the ground, it's a very different situation, you know. So the discourse that's at the global or national level is articulated very differently at the local level, you know, which I came to find out very clearly. So even though, just really quick, let me see. Okay. So even though the MST carries an agroecology and food sovereignty flag, they're not active once the encampment becomes a settlement. So the hope is that the training during the occupation, which in the case of Vinseja Março was a 10-year period, that training and the organizational structure that they formed during that period, the hope is that that kind of just organically transitions into the settlement once the settlement becomes formed. And that just proved to be the complete opposite of reality. So I found that to be a real problem, you know, in terms of people being able to transition into agroecology and then food sovereignty. So that was the research question that I came up with during the field, because it came from the field. You know, that was the problem that I saw that was happening. So one of the most significant challenges I found is that there's very little cooperation. You know, so once it does become a settlement, people turn into a very individualistic mindset. And what's interesting is that the cattle kind of supports that kind of mentality, because it's not very labor intensive. So people are able to become more individualistic. So, so as you saw in the video, my conclusion was, you know, I felt more comfortable with developing a research question that came from the field, which is what happened. But cut to 2 years later, we're not going to get into why I ended up not being able to do carry with that question. And I'm in a position now, you know, where because of COVID, there's a lot of challenges with field work and going back to the field. So I'm in a position now of reanalyzing and reinterpreting what happened in the field. So the way I'm trying to look at it now is that food sovereignty really does present a paradox. So the paradox is that the contextual adaptation of any global vision raises issues of individual choice and democratic freedoms. So the way I solve this is that I really like this quote from Bina Agarwal, where she talks a lot about the limitations of food sovereignty as a concept, especially like as an applicable concept. So it is, of course, legitimate to argue that the choices farmers make are subject to the constraints they face and the alternatives before them. It is therefore important to identify these constraints, right? Whether they be economic, institutional, technical, informational, which is what a lot of studies have done in understanding the constraints of farmers transitioning into agroecology, right? But it is equally important to recognize that the valuable rights of of voice and choice exercised by the disadvantaged in local context cannot always fall in line with preconceived trajectories defined by global movements on behalf of the disadvantaged. So this last part of the quote really spoke to me, because what I found is that the transition to cattle did not necessarily eliminate people's ability to be self-sufficient. The two things could coexist. That's kind of the paradox. So they did have ability to become self-sufficient, which is something that I had initially problematized, right? That would not be able to. So through the community food assessment, it was clear that they valued local foods, especially over industrialized foods. And the reasons they cited were very much in line with food sovereignty, because they were very aware of the issues with agrotoxins. So by producing food themselves, they would be free from all those chemicals. And they also noted just the plentifulness of growing their own food. They also acknowledged the lack of fruits and vegetables in their diet, and that's something they wish they had more access to. And it was interesting when we talked about agricultural production, they all confirmed that the most they ever produced was during the encampment phase, which makes a lot of sense in terms of the necessity of that time, right? I mean, because they really are just relying on themselves. So necessity drove the, need for growing crops. But that cooperation component is very much also alive in the encampment phase, right? So that's when you see agriculture and a lot of food production. So that was also like an interesting contradiction, that it's actually when they get their own land that they, produce less. And even the food from encampments, there's a lot of, when I was in the field, there were a lot of issues of encampments being despejado. What's the word? Being destroyed, I guess. And professors in the region were arguing for the encampments to stay in place, because that was actually a huge source of local foods in the local markets. So a lot of the food that urban, in the city, and a lot of people in the rural areas, the local food they're eating is coming a lot from these encampments. So I thought that was really interesting. And in reflecting on this paradox, I thought that a quote from one of the settlers, he said, "O gado é bom porque desemperreia rápido, mas a gente espera melhorar pro lado da agricultura, porque tem os dois lados. Quando um não dá, o outro dá." So I think that reflects this paradox in the sense of, they are doing what they can in terms of given the conditions that they're in. So I think there's a lot of maybe conversations in how to make the concept of food sovereignty more adaptable to local realities. I think that's really maybe the direction that I'm going in with this, is not being so strict on the definition of food sovereignty to being restricted to only local food economies, right? But what's kind of like that middle ground, how can Manuel find that balance between having cattle and also being self-sufficient, but hoping that agriculture will be more supported so that he can move towards that. So I think, yep, that is it.